Together, we're going to restore safety to our streets and peace to our communities. And we're going to destroy the vile criminal cartel MS-13 and many other gangs.
At 5:02 a.m., December 5th, 2025, armored FBI vehicles rolled into Newburgh from multiple directions, cutting through streets that were still silent and nearly empty. The contrast was sharp as SWAT teams and U.S. Marshals moved into position with the speed and discipline of a military unit entering hostile ground, while the city around them was barely awake. Sirens stayed off, lights were tightly controlled, and federal agents spread across several blocks that no longer felt like a neighborhood, but a sealed combat zone inside an American city. Doors were surrounded, streets were locked down, and synchronized arrest warrants were triggered at multiple locations at the same time. Confused residents stepped outside, watching heavily equipped federal teams move with a level of precision they never expected to see on their own streets. This was not a random show of force or a routine police sweep. The scale and timing made one thing clear. This operation had been planned far beyond the local level. And if you value clear, no-nonsense analysis of how federal operations unfold across the United States, like this video and subscribe to Military Power so you do not miss what comes next. For years, Newburgh has carried a reputation that extends far beyond its size, as the city has repeatedly ranked among the most violent per capita in New York State, driven not by large cartels but by tightly organized street gangs operating in small, flexible cells. These groups do not resemble old-style neighborhood crews that fight openly for territory, but instead function as compact networks built around family ties, prison connections, and shared access to drugs and firearms. Violence in Newburgh has often come in short, sudden bursts, with retaliatory shootings that fade quickly from public view, but leave a long trail of unresolved cases and rising fear among residents. What makes this structure dangerous is its resilience, because when one member is arrested or killed, another steps in without disrupting the broader operation. Over time, federal analysts observed that several of these street gangs were no longer acting independently, but were loosely coordinated through shared suppliers, shared weapons, and overlapping distribution routes. This pattern allowed violence to spread while keeping leadership layers thin and difficult to identify, creating exactly the kind of environment where local enforcement struggles to make lasting progress. Geography plays a critical role in why Newburgh drew federal attention. Sitting along the Hudson River and positioned between New York City and upstate distribution corridors, the city functions as a natural transfer point within the Hudson Valley. Drugs and illegal firearms can move north and south quickly, using highways, rail access, and river routes that blend into normal commercial traffic. From an operational perspective, Newburgh offers access without the heavy law enforcement saturation found in larger cities, making it attractive to gangs looking to expand quietly while maintaining links to suppliers closer to major ports and urban centers. Federal agencies have long viewed the Hudson Valley as more than a suburban buffer zone, but as a connective artery that can either contain or accelerate criminal spread. When violence in Newburgh began to align with seizures and arrests in neighboring counties, it signaled that local gangs were no longer isolated problems, but part of a wider distribution system moving product, weapons, and money across multiple jurisdictions. This regional dimension is what elevated Newburgh from a city struggling with crime to a strategic node worth federal scrutiny. The decision for the FBI to step in was shaped by limits faced at the local level. Newburgh police and state authorities had conducted arrests, patrol surges, and targeted operations for years, but these efforts often disrupted symptoms rather than leadership. Witness intimidation, short sentencing cycles, and the rapid reformation of crews made it difficult to dismantle networks permanently. Federal involvement offered tools that local agencies do not control, including long-term wire investigations, interstate conspiracy charges, and coordinated arrest authority across city and county lines. From the federal perspective, allowing the situation to continue carried broader risks. Each shooting increased the chance of bystander casualties, while unchecked gang expansion threatened to push violence outward into surrounding communities that lacked the experience or resources to respond. By intervening early and decisively, federal planners aimed to remove key actors simultaneously, rather than triggering a cycle of arrests and retaliation that would only reinforce the gang's hold on the area. This context explains why the operation unfolded the way it did, with multiple agencies moving at once and targets selected not for visibility, but for their position inside the network. The goal was not simply to arrest individuals, but to interrupt the structure that allowed violence and trafficking to regenerate. But the timing raises a larger question. Why launch a coordinated federal sweep on this scale at that specific moment? And what intelligence convinced investigators that the window could not be missed? And from your perspective, do you think federal agencies were right to strike the entire network in a single morning? Or would a slower approach have reduced long-term risk? Long before armored vehicles entered Newburgh, the operation had already moved through its most critical stage, one that unfolded quietly and without visible force. Federal planners treated the case not as a short-term enforcement problem, but as a slow-moving intelligence campaign designed to expose how violence, drugs, and weapons actually flowed beneath the surface of the city. This phase required patience, discipline, and the acceptance that progress would be measured in months rather than arrests. The first breakthroughs came through confidential informants, individuals already embedded in the street-level economy who understood how the gangs operated day to day. These sources did not deliver dramatic revelations all at once, but instead provided fragments of routine information: who met whom, which apartments were avoided, how firearms changed hands, and which names carried weight even when they were rarely seen in public. Over time, these fragments began to form patterns that pointed toward a small group of individuals operating above the visible street crews. At the same time, federal surveillance expanded beyond traditional patrols. Investigators used a combination of physical observation, vehicle tracking, and legally authorized electronic monitoring to confirm what informants suggested. Movements were logged, meetings were timed, and locations were cross-checked to distinguish coincidence from coordination. Analysts focused less on isolated crimes and more on repeated behaviors, especially those that suggested command and control rather than spontaneous activity. A person who rarely touched drugs or guns directly, but consistently appeared before and after violent incidents, quickly drew attention. As data accumulated, the investigation shifted into a mapping phase. Federal analysts began constructing a network model that linked individuals, locations, and activities across Newburgh and neighboring areas. This was not a traditional hierarchy with a clear leader at the top, but a web of overlapping roles, where influence mattered more than rank. Some individuals controlled access to suppliers, others managed weapon storage, while a few specialized in resolving disputes or ordering retaliation. Removing only one node would have little effect, but removing several at once could collapse the system. This mapping process also revealed how local gangs connected to broader regional routes. Transactions tied Newburgh to other parts of the Hudson Valley, while vehicle movements suggested coordination beyond city limits. The network was not large, but it was efficient, relying on silence and familiarity rather than scale. For federal planners, this confirmed that the threat was not isolated violence, but a structure capable of expanding if left intact. From this analysis emerged the list of 12 priority targets. These individuals were not chosen because they were the most visible or the most violent, but because intelligence showed they occupied positions that held the network together. Each one was linked to multiple functions, such as trafficking coordination, weapons access, or enforcement decisions. Arresting them individually over time would have warned the rest of the network, allowing replacements to step in and evidence to disappear. The only viable option was to move against all of them at once. Preparing for that moment required extensive coordination. The FBI worked closely with the ATF, U.S. Marshals, state police, and local authorities to confirm identities, locations, and daily routines. Investigators tracked where each target slept, who lived with them, and when they were most likely to be isolated. This was not done to increase force, but to reduce uncertainty and prevent unintended escalation. The objective was control, not confrontation. Risk assessment played a central role in planning. Intelligence suggested that some targets had access to firearms and had previously been involved in violent incidents, raising concerns about potential resistance. At the same time, planners recognized the dense residential environment and the presence of families and bystanders. Every arrest plan was designed to limit movement, shorten engagement time, and avoid scenarios that could spill into surrounding streets. As the operation date approached, the investigation entered its final phase. Surveillance confirmed that the targets remained active and unaware of the scope of the case against them. Communications patterns stayed consistent, suggesting no internal alarm. This stability was critical because it indicated that the network still believed it was operating below the threshold of federal attention. By this point, the investigation had achieved what federal planners consider the ideal condition: clarity without exposure. Authorities knew who to arrest, where to find them, and how each removal would affect the network as a whole. The remaining question was not whether to act, but when. When the time was chosen, it was chosen deliberately. Early morning hours offered the greatest control, minimizing movement and reducing the likelihood of coordination between targets. Once the first team moved, the rest would follow within minutes, leaving no gap for warnings or escape. This intelligence phase explains why the raid unfolded with such precision and speed. It was not driven by urgency alone, but by confidence built through months of observation, analysis, and planning. By the time federal teams entered Newburgh, the outcome was already largely determined. And this leads to the next phase of the story. When preparation ends and action begins, theory meets reality. The question was no longer whether the network could be dismantled, but how quickly it would collapse once federal teams moved in. At 5:02 a.m. on December 5th, 2025, the operation crossed the final threshold, shifting from months of planning into live execution, and from that moment forward, time became the controlling factor. Federal teams were already staged across Newburgh before most residents were awake, each unit locked to a shared timeline rather than reacting to events on the ground. This was not a race, but a sequence, where every movement was designed to overlap with another and leave no gaps in between. The first phase unfolded almost invisibly. Containment units moved into position at key intersections and access points, using unmarked vehicles and low-profile posture to avoid drawing attention. Streets surrounding each target location were quietly sealed. Secondary routes were observed, and potential escape paths were neutralized before they could be used. From a command perspective, this was the decisive moment. Once containment was confirmed, the network's ability to warn, regroup, or relocate was effectively eliminated. No phone call could outrun a locked perimeter. By 5:05 a.m., status updates began to converge at Federal Command. Each location reported containment established, with no unexpected movement detected. The city still appeared calm, but beneath that surface, the operational map showed Newburgh divided into controlled zones, each managed by a separate team, yet synchronized to the same clock. The advantage was no longer surprise alone, but compression, forcing all decision-making into a window too small for reaction. At 5:06 a.m., entry authorization was released across all teams. Breach elements moved forward almost simultaneously, applying methods tailored to each structure rather than relying on uniform force. Some entries were resolved immediately, with doors opened and suspects secured within moments. Others required brief physical control, but none escalated beyond what planners had anticipated. Speed mattered, but precision mattered more. The objective was to gain control before confusion could turn into resistance. Throughout the operation, coordination was continuous and disciplined. Command staff monitored each site in real time, tracking progress not as isolated events, but as components of a single system. Reports came in sequence: entry complete, subject detained, location secure. When minor delays occurred at individual sites, nearby units adjusted posture without altering the overall timeline. This flexibility was built into the plan from the beginning, recognizing that urban environments rarely behave exactly as expected. One of the defining features of the raid was the absence of prolonged confrontation. Intelligence had identified specific time windows when targets were most likely to be isolated and least capable of mounting resistance. These decisions were not tactical guesses, but conclusions drawn from long-term surveillance and behavior analysis. By striking early and decisively, federal teams removed many of the variables that typically lead to standoffs, pursuits, or gunfire. Control replaced escalation. From inside the command structure, the operation unfolded as a steady stream of confirmations rather than dramatic turning points. This was by design. Federal planners aim to eliminate uncertainty long before teams move so that action becomes confirmation rather than discovery. As the sweep progressed, it became clear that the network had no meaningful opportunity to adapt. The very traits that once protected it, fragmentation, silence, and speed, now worked against it when pressure was applied everywhere at once. Outside the perimeters, the city experienced a different reality. Residents waking early noticed streets blocked by unfamiliar vehicles and federal agents positioned with quiet authority. There were no sirens, no shouting, and no visible chaos, only a controlled presence that felt unusual in its calm. For a city accustomed to sudden violence and rapid retaliation, this form of intervention felt unfamiliar, almost clinical. Order replaced unpredictability, even if only temporarily. By 5:15 a.m., the sweep was largely complete. All priority targets were reported in custody, with no serious injuries and no unresolved locations. Teams began the process of transitioning from action to stabilization, verifying identities, securing sites, and preparing for withdrawal. Perimeters were lifted gradually, not all at once, to maintain control as normal movement resumed. The goal was to restore routine without signaling vulnerability. What stands out about this phase is not what was taken, but what was denied. The network was denied time, denied communication, and denied the chance to make decisions under pressure. From a strategic standpoint, this is the essence of modern federal enforcement. Success is measured not by spectacle, but by the absence of reaction from the opposing system. When nothing happens in response to a raid, it often means the plan worked. As federal teams withdrew, the city appeared largely unchanged. Streets reopened, traffic resumed, and daily routines slowly returned. Yet beneath that surface normality, the internal balance had shifted. Leadership links were gone, communication channels were disrupted, and remaining actors were left uncertain and exposed. This kind of disruption does not announce itself loudly, but it reshapes the environment in ways that unfold over weeks rather than hours. The strategic message of the raid was unmistakable. By acting everywhere at once, federal agencies demonstrated reach, coordination, and inevitability. The operation made clear that gang networks are no longer evaluated only by individual crimes, but by patterns of movement, relationships, and regional impact. When those patterns align, response is not gradual or symbolic. It is synchronized and decisive. For Newburgh, the sweep marked a clear break from the cycles of retaliation that had defined recent years. For the Hudson Valley, it served as a warning that regional corridors are not invisible. And at a national level, the implications were broader still. This was not an isolated show of force, but a template, one that can be applied wherever similar conditions exist. What remained uncertain was not the success of the raid itself, but what would follow. Disruption creates opportunity, but also invites adaptation. Whether this operation would lead to lasting stability or provoke new strategies elsewhere depended on what came next and how firmly pressure would be maintained once the initial shock had passed. In the days following the operation, the most immediate change in Newburgh was not dramatic celebration or visible relief, but a noticeable pause. The pattern of sudden retaliatory violence that had defined recent years slowed as key figures who once coordinated disputes, weapons access, and enforcement decisions were no longer on the street. For local law enforcement, this created a rare window of stability. Patrol data showed fewer emergency calls tied to gang-related activity, and intelligence units reported a sharp drop in communication between remaining street-level actors. While no operation can erase criminal behavior overnight, removing central nodes disrupted the rhythm that had sustained violence. From a security standpoint, the operation also reduced the risk of rapid regeneration. Because the arrests were executed simultaneously, there was no clear successor ready to step in. Smaller crews were left fragmented, uncertain who could give direction or authorize retaliation. This uncertainty matters because modern street gangs often rely on confidence and perceived protection as much as manpower. When that confidence breaks, recruitment slows and internal disputes increase, weakening the structure further. Federal planners view this phase as critical because sustained pressure during this period can prevent networks from rebuilding under new leadership. Beyond Newburgh, the raid carried a broader federal deterrence message. By intervening decisively in a mid-sized city rather than a major metropolitan center, the FBI signaled that geography alone no longer provides insulation. For years, many criminal networks have assumed that federal attention would focus on large ports, border cities, or high-profile urban areas, leaving smaller communities to local enforcement. This operation challenged that assumption directly. It demonstrated that when patterns of violence and distribution align, federal agencies are willing to deploy full-scale coordination regardless of location. The deterrent effect was not about fear, but about predictability. The message was simple. Networks that cross jurisdictions, move weapons and drugs regionally, and generate repeated violence will eventually trigger a federal response that is swift and comprehensive. By acting everywhere at once, the operation reinforced the idea that fragmentation and silence are no longer reliable shields. For other groups operating along the Hudson Valley and similar corridors nationwide, the implications were difficult to ignore. Local reaction reflected the complexity of federal intervention. Many residents expressed relief, viewing the operation as a necessary step after years of instability and unresolved shootings. Community leaders acknowledged the immediate security benefits, while also emphasizing the need for follow-up investment in prevention, youth programs, and economic support. At the same time, some voices raised concerns about the scale of the response, questioning whether aggressive federal tactics could strain trust or disproportionately impact certain neighborhoods. These debates are not unique to Newburgh, but they highlight the balance federal agencies must navigate between enforcement and long-term community stability. Politically, local officials were placed in a delicate position. Public support for reducing violence was strong, yet there was also pressure to ensure transparency and accountability. Statements focused on cooperation rather than confrontation, emphasizing that the operation was the result of shared intelligence and mutual goals. This framing matters because sustained security gains depend on continued collaboration between federal and local institutions, not one-time interventions. When compared to similar operations across the United States, the Newburgh raid fits into a broader federal pattern. In cities from the Midwest to the Southeast, coordinated sweeps targeting entire gang structures rather than individual offenders have become more common. These operations prioritize intelligence depth, synchronized timing, and regional impact over dramatic arrests. While results vary, evidence suggests that when executed correctly, such strategies are more effective at reducing sustained violence than piecemeal enforcement. However, federal planners are careful not to overstate success. History shows that criminal networks adapt, shifting routes, recruiting replacements, or relocating activity to neighboring areas. This is why the Newburgh operation was designed as a disruption point, not an endpoint. Follow-on investigations, financial tracking, and probation enforcement are expected to continue, extending pressure beyond the initial arrests. Taken together, the aftermath of the raid illustrates a strategic shift in how federal agencies approach domestic gang violence. Rather than reacting to individual incidents, they are increasingly focused on identifying structural patterns and acting before violence spreads further. Newburgh became a test case for this approach, demonstrating both its potential and its limits. But this raises a final, national-level question. If federal agencies can move this decisively in one city, how many other networks across the country are already being mapped in silence, waiting for the moment when preparation ends and action begins? The operation in Newburgh was not defined by spectacle, seized evidence, or dramatic confrontation, but by structure, coordination, and timing. Federal agencies acted as a single system, combining intelligence, planning, and execution to remove key actors without triggering wider instability. What unfolded showed how modern enforcement now prioritizes precision over noise and disruption over reaction. More importantly, the case highlights a model that goes beyond one city. When federal and local agencies share intelligence, align objectives, and act together, they can reach networks that once relied on fragmentation and silence to survive. This approach does not promise instant solutions, but it does change the balance, forcing criminal systems to operate under constant pressure rather than comfortable neglect. The larger issue now stretches beyond Newburgh. As federal planners refine these methods, the same framework can be applied to other corridors, other cities, and other networks that appear quiet on the surface but remain active underneath. The question is not whether similar operations will happen again, but where and how soon. If you want clear, grounded analysis of U.S. federal operations and the strategies shaping domestic security today, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Military Power. And let us know your view in the comments. Do coordinated federal sweeps like this represent the future of crime control in America? Or do they raise new challenges that have yet to be answered?